What up, everybody? John the Morgile here, going to do a video response to NASA employee Michelle Thaller. I was just perusing YouTube today and thought I would do a YouTube search for flat Earth and see what kind of videos I could stumble on, maybe some new arguments or proofs, or just, like to watch flat Earth stuff from time to time. And of course, really all you can find are maybe a couple of decent flat Earth videos and just a bunch of globe Earth shilling videos and proofs, reasons why the Earth is a globe, and it's always the same handful of arguments that we've heard, our entire lives, and certainly for the last few years in this fake space flat Earth paradigm. But of course, this one here, I've sort of listened to a little bit of it. I didn't necessarily sit down and listen to the whole thing, but I just wanted to see if NASA paid astronomer, this so-called scientist, has done anything remarkable in terms of proving the spinning ball Earth theory or debunking the flat Earth reality. Because after all, they are, this is an impartial scientist here, so they must have looked at the evidence and come up with data that proves a spherical spinning and orbiting Earth. So without further ado, we'll get into it, and I'll break in and comment as necessary. Hope you enjoy.
So, Oscar, you asked the question, what are some of the easiest ways that you can prove that the Earth is round? Because apparently this is something that we're debating. I have no idea why.
Well, clearly this person is out of touch with reality, because the reason that we're talking about this or debating it, really there's nothing to debate. The reason is the Earth isn't a spinning ball in space. And so other than that, either this woman is brainwashed like everyone else and is therefore incapable of being an objective scientist when it comes to this topic, or she's lying. I don't think that anybody paid by NASA to spout the globe Earth nonsense is a liar. I really just don't think that they're liars per se, because they believe what they're saying. They believe what everyone was taught since we were little kids in, diapers practically for many of us. And, the fact of the matter is the Earth doesn't have curvature. It's not in motion whatsoever. This is all demonstrable, very obvious facts, and that's why it's being discussed, because practically everyone in the world believes that they live stuck to the side of a spinning sphere in space, when there is absolutely no evidence for that whatsoever, and a whole world full of evidence to the contrary.
That's a hard thing for me to even start talking about, because there are so many proofs that the Earth is round, it's difficult to know where to start. And it's not okay to think that the Earth is flat. This is not a viable argument.
Okay, at this point, clearly this woman is not going to consider the obvious fact that the Earth isn't a spinning ball. Offhand, it's going to be rejected. There is no possibility of a rational, skeptical, scientific inquiry if the person fails to even think about or consider or humor as any argument. Doesn't matter what the argument is. So if you refuse offhand to just completely ignore a subject altogether and revert to things that we were all taught as very young people in the federal education system, that isn't science. That is more akin to a religion. But right off the bat, you know that this person is not going to actually look at any of this evidence and consider we'll call it a theory for this point. They're not even going to consider the theory that the Earth could actually be a stationary plane. They're not going to consider the notion that the Earth is anything but a spinning ball in the vacuum of infinite space theory. And it is this exact refusal to look at evidence, disconnection from reality, cognitive dissonance, masquerading as objective science, that allows for this deception to perpetuate and expand without anyone even realizing that it is in fact a deception. So, in other words, you don't have to be a deceiver to disseminate and perpetuate the deception of the spinning ball Earth. All you have to do is be, programmed by that system, and that is the wide and mostly tread path. It's only when you stop and think for a minute, okay, well, maybe I was wrong about some of this stuff, and look at the evidence, that you come to the stark realization that all of theoretical astrophysics is, in fact, fantasy and a long series of deceptions and misunderstandings.
I have friends who have been on the International Space Station. They have orbited the Earth once every 90 minutes. I have had personal experience with people that have been up in space and can see with their own eyes that the Earth is round.
Okay, so I'm going to go on record here and say that anyone who claims to have been in space and see that the Earth is round is necessarily a liar. So, yes, okay, there are a handful of key people at NASA who are in on the deception, but I would say far more than 90% of even the people at NASA have absolutely no clue as to what's going on. Now, anyone who's a so-called astronaut and claims to have been in space and see the ball Earth or walk around on the moon, they are necessarily a liar, because there is absolutely no question, absolutely no doubt, once you look at this topic, that the Earth, first of all, doesn't have curvature, it's not a sphere, couldn't possibly be a sphere of any sort, shape, or size. So that would mean like an oblate spheroid. It isn't that either. And it certainly is not in any motion whatsoever. The Earth has never moved a single yard, and yet they claim that it's spinning around an axis over 1,000 miles an hour at the equator, while orbiting the Sun at over 60,000 miles an hour. And that's not even to mention the solar frame of reference or the galactic frame of reference. But the fact of the matter is no one in history has ever detected, felt, measured, or proven this motion in any way, shape, or form. The Earth is stationary and is easily proven to be stationary, not just a hypothetically fixed frame of reference, but a stationary object that does not and will never move. In terms of orbiting around orbiting around in space, that's a fantasy.
And of course, we've taken all these amazing pictures from space. They're so beautiful, all those pictures of the Earth.
Right, but we know that they're faking those. And just one example of why we know they're faking those, you can see this shot of the so-called planet Earth, where the relative sizes of the continents have changed drastically relative to the overall sphere. Frankly, this proves that they are deceiving us, and certainly we can agree that they have the ability to fake pictures. But the fact of the matter is they are and have indeed faked pictures of the globe Earth. So we must disregard everything that NASA purports and all of their claims about this ball Earth, because we know that it cannot be.
So I don't really know what's going on right now with this Earth is flat thing, but I will tell you that this is one of the things I really enjoyed teaching my own astronomy class about, because there are proofs all around you. It is not difficult to know that the Earth is round. In fact, people have known this for way more than 2,000 years. The ancient Greeks actually had a number of really elegant, wonderful proofs that the Earth was a sphere. So let's start from the simple to the slightly more complicated. One of the things you can see yourself with a pair of binoculars is if you actually go out to a lake and there are boats on that lake, the farther away a boat is, the more the bottom of the boat will disappear, and you'll basically just see the mast of the boat. And as a boat goes farther and farther away, the last thing you will see is the very top of the mast of that boat. And that's because the boat is actually going over the horizon that's curved.
The ship's over the horizon, really. As if we've never heard that argument before. This is just a perfect example of how this person is regurgitating the propaganda about the ball Earth that we all learned when we were very young. Um, the fact of the matter is, when ships go out away from you towards the horizon. What we're experiencing when they disappear bottom first is an operation of perspective and refraction. It's those two things which cause this phenomenon to occur. Now, thousands of years ago, when they came up with this alleged evidence of the ball Earth, I don't believe they were factoring in refraction, for one. Certainly not the ancient Greeks or even Columbus, as refraction of light wasn't even discovered until the 1600s. And that plays a huge role. But furthermore, without refraction, with perspective alone, you would expect to see this exact thing, because anything that's jutting up over the horizon line, as it goes past the horizon, you're not going to be able to see the bottom of it uh, at a much faster rate than the top will be invisible due to the horizon. Um, this is a natural operation of perspective. When you've got parallel lines running out away from you towards the distant horizon, as long as those parallel lines are equidistant from your line of sight, they will appear to converge at the same point. Um, and so when like the top of a ship is say 15 foot higher than your line of sight, it's going to disappear last over the horizon, just as a natural operation of how our vision works. But furthermore, you have refraction, which is causing the light to tend downward with distance, and so you get this effect where the ship is actually apparently dropping more drastically than without refraction. And so this does create sort of an illusion that that ship is actually going over a curve. However, if you zoom in on a ship that has totally vanished to the naked eye with some sort of optical device, it will be restored because it hasn't gone over any sort of curve. It just has appeared to merge with the optical horizon because the angular size of the object has apparently diminished to something indistinguishable to the naked eye. And so again, it appears as though that ship has dropped below a curve of the horizon. But the sole fact that we can zoom back in on such a ship and get it to be restored does disprove this argument quite nicely. Now, this just goes to show you that the person who's arguing this point hasn't looked at the flat earth phenomenon with anything but complete incredulity. So they haven't looked at it objectively or scientifically. She's totally disregarded the notion and proceeds to regurgitate things that we've all heard really our entire lives. So no points earned here. The ships going over the horizon is no evidence of anything. It proves nothing other than people's propensity to call something an exclusive proof of a spherical world, when in fact this phenomenon is exactly what you would expect and indeed do see on the stationary plane Earth.
And that means that as it goes farther and farther away, you see less and less of the bottom of it and more of the top of that. You can see that with binoculars, by an ocean, by a lake. It's really easy. That wouldn't happen if the Earth were flat.
Well, actually, that's exactly what you would expect to see on the flat Earth, as I've said. Perspective and how the horizon optically works is exactly what you'd expect to see on a flat Earth. It's claimed by ball Earth lions that the horizon is caused by the point on the ball Earth where everything begins to drop away from you. And so you can't see anything beyond that point because it is physically vertically descended. And what the horizon is, in fact, and demonstrably is, it's an optical phenomenon where anything that is higher than the horizon as it goes beyond the horizon is going to continue to diminish in angular size due to perspective, apparently. However, it's only going to apparently diminish from the top down because, of course, we can't see through the ground or the water that comprises the horizon. So this argument that we wouldn't expect to see vertically descending ships apparently on a flat Earth is fallacious. And in fact, when you add refraction into the mix, it is perfectly explained. However, I do see how ancient scientists, for lack of a better word, were tricked by this. Although you would think that modern science, with our knowledge of refraction and perspective, that they would understand that this point proves nothing. And in fact, the simple fact that we can indeed zoom in on a ship that has apparently gone over the horizon and restore that ship pretty much in its entirety debunks the notion that ships are going over the curve. And of course, anyone that's looked at this flat Earth phenomenon for even 10 seconds objectively and actually considered the points that are made would realize that this is a moot point. It proves nothing.
You would simply see the boat getting smaller and smaller and smaller as it went farther away, but you'd be able to see the whole thing with the same proportions.
Clearly, this person has absolutely no practical understanding of how perspective works. Again, what we see with the ships over the horizon phenomenon is not exclusive to a sphere. It is, in fact, an operation of perspective coupled with a bit of refraction, which causes this illusion of objects going over the curve. When this bit of evidence was first purported by the ancients, as she said, thousands of years ago, they had absolutely no knowledge of refraction.
Now, another way that you can tell that we're on a sphere is to think about how there's something called the tropics on the Earth. And the tropics are places near the equator of the Earth where sometimes the sun is overhead in the sky. And this was actually something that the Greeks used not only to prove that the Earth was round about 2,000 years ago, but they actually measured the circumference of the Earth accurate to within just a couple percent. 2,000 years ago, we've known that the Earth was round. There was a really brilliant Greek scientist called Eratosthenes. And Eratosthenes noticed that there was a town called Syene, and on a certain date, the sun would actually shine straight down to the bottom of a well. That meant the sun was directly overhead. You could look down a well and see the sun shining back at you. And on the very same date, farther away in the city of Alexandria, that didn't happen. The sun was not directly overhead. It was a slight angle. And all that Eratosthenes did was he measured the difference in the angle of the sun. It was straight overhead in Syene. In Alexandria, it was a little bit less than overhead. And he rationed that that change in angle from one city to another was probably indicative of us being on a curved surface. And you could make all kinds of measurements, even between those two cities, and see that the angles were different. The sun was at a different place in the sky.
So that says it all. He assumed that this was probably indicative of us being on a curved surface.
Was probably indicative of us being on a curved surface.
However, what he did not assume is that it could also be due to the light itself curving, for lack of a better phrase, again, due to refraction. However, in one assumption, you must assume that we're on a curved surface and the sun is practically infinitely distant. In the other assumption, that we're on a flat surface and the sun is relatively nearby and that the light is actually refracting. So again, this assumption that we live on a sphere and then constructing mathematics based on that assumption proves nothing other than how great we are with mathematics. The simple fact is that the data extracted from this experiment can be interpreted by two different manners, either the assumption that we're on a sphere or by the assumption that we're on a plane. And the math can be worked out in either example. However, if you assume that we're on a plane, you run into some problems if you don't factor in refraction. See, the ancient Greeks had no idea about refraction, and yet we know that this is a factor in light, especially when it's coming through the rich atmosphere of the Earth. So this is just another example of absolute ignorance masquerading as science. Because we know, in fact, that there is no curvature to the Earth. So the assumption of Eratosthenes was incorrect. The underlying foundational assumption of that experiment, or rather the extrapolation of the data gleaned from the experiment, is it's a faulty foundation.
Using this, he actually measured the circumference of the Earth, and he got it right 2,000 years ago. So another really simple proof is that on any given date, at different cities and different places around the world, the sun is at different angles in the sky. That wouldn't happen if the Earth wasn't round.
See, what she just said is a big problem among globe earthers. She said that the different positions of the sun in the sky wouldn't happen on a flat Earth, and that may be true if we assume the values purported by the globe Earth model. So they believe that the sun is like 800,000 miles wide and is 93 million miles away. And so the only way that you can have day and night is if the Earth is a ball. However, the flat earthers are not saying that the Earth is that large or distant, but the sun is a local phenomenon, so it is quite natural to see it at different elevation angles at the same time, just simply due to, again, perspective as well as atmospheric refraction. But the fact that she is trying to juxtapose the heliocentric model onto flat Earth is telling, because it just goes to show that she hasn't looked at this at all, and she is merely, again, regurgitating what we were all taught in federally mandated education system.
Then there are some other proofs that are a little more obscure, but they're actually really lovely. And one is to observe what happens during a lunar eclipse. Now, a lunar eclipse happens when the Earth casts a shadow on the moon. The moon actually goes dark. In fact, if you've seen one, you can actually see the Earth's shadow go across the moon. And when the moon is entirely in the Earth's shadow, the moon looks kind of dark and even kind of red colored. It's really, really beautiful.
Okay, so first she's assuming that the Earth is what's casting a shadow on the moon when there is no evidence for the Earth being the object casting the shadow in the first place. So that is a pretty huge assumption. And when you have things like selenelions, where during lunar eclipses people have observed the sun and the moon above the horizon at the same time during a total lunar eclipse, this debunks the notion that it is actually the Earth casting a shadow on the moon. And, you know, we can demonstrate all day long that the Earth isn't a ball through practical, repeatable measurements here on the ground in reality. We don't have to point to celestial events to provide evidence for the claim that the Earth isn't a ball. It is only the ball earthers who need these sort of wild gymnastics of theory to paint their theory as something more realistic than it is. So, in other words, since we know the Earth isn't a ball, and we know that the sun isn't, 93 million miles away, the entire heliocentric model is wrong, then we know it is not the Earth casting shadows upon the moon. It couldn't possibly be, and yet these people make the assumption that it is the Earth casting a shadow on the moon to support their theory. So again, it's more mental gymnastics that people do in order to perpetuate the deception, whether they're witting or not is irrelevant, of the ball Earth. It is a deception whether they know it or not.
What's happening in that case is that the sun is on one side of the Earth. The Earth is in the middle, and it's casting a shadow. The Earth is casting a shadow on the moon. And as the shadow moves across the moon, you'll notice that the shadow is curved, it's round.
I just love how she's mansplaining what the lunar eclipse is in her model, as if people who know the Earth isn't a spinning ball have somehow never heard of the conventional explanation for lunar eclipses, which is absurd, and it speaks volumes to the level of ignorance that these people just completely believe that we somehow were raised in the modern era without any knowledge of what they claim is going on in the heavens. It really is an insult to the truth when you have people like this just complete the embodiment of arrogance and ignorance, trying to mansplain things that we have all been, spoon-fed our entire lives.
So something like the sun that's bigger than the Earth and is able to cast a shadow of the Earth on the moon can actually show you the shape of the Earth.
Yes, and these are shadows that diminish in angular size proportionally with distance from the obstructing object. So this is exactly the opposite of how light and shadow actually behave in reality. And yet, in order for the heliocentric ball Earth model to work, you must have shadows which diminish in angular size proportionally with distance, because we've seen in solar eclipses where the moon is apparently transiting the sun, according to observers on the Earth, the moon's shadow is often 50 or 60 miles in diameter, and sometimes as little as like 2 miles in diameter. And this is absolute concrete evidence that the moon is not some 1,000-mile radius object 250,000 miles away. Light and shadow simply do not behave as they claim, and I'm really glad that she brought this up, as if we didn't know, this is what her claim was, as if she's teaching anyone anything by making these claims that we've all heard and quite frankly have debunked years ago.
Aha, you might say, but could the Earth be a disk? Could it be flat, but it's actually still shaped like a disk, not like a sphere?
See, in no flat Earth model is the Earth going around the sun. In no flat Earth model are we flying around in space with the sun and the moon orbiting around us or anything like that. The sun and the moon are above us, over the plane. And the notion that somehow, people might think that we're on a disk flying around the sun in space is absurd to any real proponent for the flat Earth truth.
There was a Greek scientist called Aristarchus, and what he noticed was that you can get a lunar eclipse at many different angles where the sun is. Sometimes the shadow goes straight across the moon. Sometimes it just kind of glances the moon. Just a little bit is in shadow, just on the top or on the bottom. From every different vantage point, every different angle that the sun is casting a shadow, you always get a perfectly curved shadow.
Okay, let's just say hypothetically that the moon is a sphere and you cast a straight line shadow on it. Just hypothesizing here, would not that straight line shadow appear to be a curve on a spherical surface? This argument proves absolutely nothing about the Earth, as again, it is absolutely not the Earth casting the shadow, but the claim that only spherical objects cast curved shadows is a moot claim, because if the moon itself is curved, then even a straight line shadow will appear to be curved when cast upon that surface.
The only shape that can cast a shadow that's curved from any direction you put the light is a sphere.
And, that is another false claim, I believe, because in order to get a lunar eclipse, you must have an alignment, in the heliocentric model anyways, you must have an alignment between the sun, the Earth, and the moon upon the ecliptic plane, more or less. That's why you might get partial lunar eclipses, as if the moon and Earth are slightly misaligned to the ecliptic in the heliocentric model. So this claim that you have all these different angles involved is preposterous, and again, we know that it isn't even the Earth casting these shadows.
So people have known that the Earth is spherical for thousands of years.
Yes, people have known the Earth was spherical long before we knew what refraction of light was.
It's not okay to say that the Earth is flat.
The Earth is actually flat, and infinite space is a fantasy.
This is some sort of strange denial. I don't know where it comes from.
The irony of that statement is absolutely palpable.
And it's something where I keep getting this question. We really need to put this question to bed, because we've known the Earth is a sphere for a long time.
The only way that you're going to put this question to bed is if you actually review the evidence that we're pointing to skeptically and objectively, and the question will be put to bed by proving it as an affirmative. So while the Earth is actually a stationary plane, you and most other people believe that you live stuck to the side of a spinning sphere. Denial of common sense is a running theme with people who believe in the ball Earth. I don't know what else to say other than people who claim that this is a scientifically derived conclusion in terms of the ball Earth. It is merely something we were taught forcibly when we were very young, and so we believe it as an ultimate truth. However, upon skeptical, objective examination, it becomes very clear that the Earth couldn't possibly be a ball spinning around and orbiting.
There's some even well-meaning people that have kind of, they say, well, I don't really believe the Earth is flat, but I'm not really sure what to think about it. And they've asked me some interesting questions like, They've heard that that space is very hot. That when you go up above the atmosphere, the temperature of space is millions of degrees, which is true. The problem is there's basically no air at all. So the gas right around the Earth is actually millions of degrees hot. That's actually true, but there's almost none of it. There's almost nothing. Like one single proton whizzes by you at a temperature of 1,000,000 degrees. It's not the same as temperature like in the air. It's not the same thing at all.
Well, this is a huge problem for NASA, even if you are talking about small particles of high-intensity heat, which I don't necessarily agree with, but for argument's sake, we'll say that the thermosphere is millions of degrees hot. However, it's not a conventional heat in the sense of you've got very disparate particles of high temperature. However, the average heat of a given area is going to be very, very cold. Now, the problem is when you get into subjects like the LISS, or the International Space Station, their claim is that they're in the thermosphere. Now, the problem is you've got that LISS is allegedly made out of materials that are very conductive to heat. And the problem is when that thing's been up there allegedly for over 15 years, there's nowhere for that heat to go. And so you have a transfer of heat through convection of those tiny disparate particles, colliding with the ISS or the LISS over time. There's nowhere for that heat to go through convection. And so over time, you would expect the LISS to be like a broiling oven. Now, on the other hand, this whole idea of heat being transferred through these disparate particles in a vacuum, to me, is absurd, because the entire concept of heat, you must have a medium or an ambient atmosphere to transfer that heat. And so when you're talking about disparate particles in a vacuum, I would say that that is a very cold area. However, these particles are allegedly superheated. However, the whole thing goes against the LISS being up there for 15 years, because what are they doing to get rid of all of that heat that has been conducted and stored in the materials of the ISS over 15 years plus? It's ridiculous.
So that one was one that I get sometimes. And the other one is, I actually said this to somebody, and I couldn't believe they'd never thought of it, that, with binoculars, you can see planets. You can see Saturn and Jupiter. You can see Mars with a telescope, the sun, the moon. Everything else you see in the solar system is a sphere. So we're the one thing that is different. And that actually made somebody who was more interested in actually hearing information, that actually got them to think. They were like, you're right. Everything else we take a picture of is a sphere.
Well, whomever you were discussing that with obviously never lived a day on planet Earth. We were all taught our entire lives that because these objects in the sky are spherical, then the Earth must therefore be spherical. Anyone who hadn't heard that must have been living under a rock for their entire lives. The fact of the matter is the objects or the lights in the night sky are nothing akin to the Earth. Even if the sky is full of spheres, does not therefore make the Earth a sphere. Just because pool balls are spherical doesn't prove pool tables to be spherical. The Earth is something completely separate and different from the lights in the night sky. Just because the sun appears to be a circle does not equate to proof of the Earth's sphericity. This is a ridiculous argument. It has absolutely no basis in fact. It is merely a fairy tale, a fantasy that was foisted upon us when we were very young, and in no way proves anything but people's ability to be convinced that they live on a spinning ball in space, when in fact we all live upon the stationary physical plane where the sky and the heavens are above us. Yes, there is actually an objective up and down in reality. It isn't relative to your position on a sphere. The Earth has never been a sphere. It has never moved. And we can show pictorial evidence of mountains 273 miles away. The very tip of that peak should be over a half a mile below the horizon line. So the Earth has no curvature. If you take an airplane and fly it in any direction at any speed and then perform a proper nosedive, the ground beneath will be stationary. And this proves that the Earth isn't spinning around. These are basic physical pieces of evidence that anyone can verify to show that the Earth isn't in motion and it is not a sphere. And so that is the basis of this argument. We need not go into explanations for what the heavens are or what the sun is or how far it is in order to prove that the Earth isn't a spinning ball. This is very a basic, observable, common sense thing that if you can possibly detach yourself for 1 second, even if just for argument's sake, detach yourself from the globe Earth programming, it becomes very clear and obvious that the Earth is a stationary plane. So with that, I'm going to wrap this one up, guys. Thanks so much for watching. If you would like to support this channel, your support is greatly needed. You can do a one-time contribution to PayPal to www.paypal.me/themorgile, or a recurring monthly contribution for as little as $1 per month to Patreon at www.patreon.com/themorgile. So with that, God bless you all. Thanks so much for watching. And spread the word, spread the world, and peace out, everybody.
Make the earth shake. Rock, rock on. Make the earth shake. Rock, 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 rock on. Make the earth shake. Make the earth shake.